Bryce Crittenden.
Hi, I'm Caroline Land, and welcome to a special bonus episode of EPL's Overdue Finds.
Caroline, how are you today?
I'm doing really well, Bryce. How are you?
Good. I'm really looking forward to today's episode. And it's always great too when we can bring these special bonus episodes to listeners. I know we just released one a couple of weeks ago when we brought to you the audio from Capital City in Conversation that was hosted by Kate Gibson. And today we're bringing you another talk that was hosted by us here at EPL. It was on Zoom, and we're really pleased to be sharing that audio with you today because really over the last few months, of course, the conversation about racism has been brought to the forefront after the unnecessary death of George Floyd. It's an important topic and something that we're going to be covering in today's episode. Caroline, we always chat about different topics that we're going to do on the podcast. This came up, and it's one of those ones where I kind of feel like I definitely felt like that. I'm not an expert on this topic, and this is something that, in my opinion, I'm sure you share this too, that we should be kind of leaving to the experts, and especially with me being a white male, this is something for me that I can listen to and learn from.
Absolutely. I think that there are places for all kinds of conversations, and there are places where we might be able to use the privilege that we carry to inform some of the conversations. But it's also really so important to listen to the voices of people with different experience and different perspectives and lived experience as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So the talk that we're going to be sharing with you today was called A Conversation About Racism in Canada. And you probably saw that by the episode title. So this was a program that we shared on August 5th. And just like kind of the last bonus episode called Capital City in Conversation, we wanted to kind of share this audio with everybody. Obviously our regular listeners, but just the general public too, who maybe weren't able to join us for that initial discussion that we had on Zoom. Because I know at one point it was fully booked. I think we had over 80 people on the wait list to join. So we're really happy to be sharing that audio with everybody today. And joining us to chat about this program is our colleague here at EPL, and it's EPL's Manager of Adult Services and City of Learners, Melanie St. Ange. Melanie, welcome back to Overdue Finds. How are you today?
I'm great. Happy to be back.
Melanie, it's so great to be talking with you again. I also want to say your son Luca was one of the most popular guests on the show. We reference him frequently because his picks just stayed with us. So it's great to have another member of the St. Ange family back with us.
Yes. Yeah, I just live in Luca's shadow. That's my life.
I was just going to say, you were last on with us. I think it was last summer, and when we were chatting about adulting and some of the life skills classes that we were introducing at the time. So, it's great to have you back.
So, as Bryce mentioned, your job title includes City of Learners. Can you let our listeners know a little bit more about what City of Learners is?
Yes. So City of Learners is actually an initiative that was started by Don Iveson when he was a counselor. It was his idea to get Edmonton to have a designation of City of Learners, which is a formal designation. And now it is an initiative that is led by the community, but that lives at EPL. So our role is to work collaboratively and creatively with community partners, looking for different opportunities for people in Edmonton to learn. So it could be formal or informal, but we're really just always looking for inclusive learning opportunities for everyone in the city.
So this event that we had originally hosted and that we're sharing today, a conversation about racism in Canada. Melanie, I know kind of behind the scenes, you'd kind of been working to put this together for for a while. Can you let everybody know kind of how this talk all came together?
Yeah, we really wanted to engage with our community on this because we know that a lot of our customers, a lot of the people who use EPL have a really big interest in topics like this, like social justice or racial injustice specifically. So I was really keen to put something together that would really center the voices of people of color in our city specifically, because we often have this idea, and this will come out in the podcast, but there's this sense that Canada is better than the US when it comes to this type of thing, and that that people here don't experience racism in an overt way. But as you'll hear from the people who speak to us in this event, in this episode, that definitely they have experienced all types of overt and also subtle structural racism that's kind of embedded in our Canadian institutions. So as much as we would like to think that we are exempt from this or that it doesn't impact the people of our country in the same way, it absolutely does. It has a really big impact on all people of color in Edmonton and in Canada. So this is what I wanted. We wanted to provide an opportunity for people to share with us their perspective. And I just wanted to find panelists who could share their story and really have a really kind of deep and engaging conversation about this topic.
It's one of the wonderful things about libraries is the ability to really engage with our local community, where we can have these conversations, but it's not just a big abstract topic. We're able to really focus in on locally, Edmonton, Alberta, Canada versus the world type of thing, around what people have experienced and the lived experiences that they've had.
Mm-hmm.
You have a great panel participating in this talk. Could you preview for us who we'll be hearing from?
Yes, we had 4 amazing panelists join us, one of which was Rochelle Ignacio, who is a safety and inclusion specialist, and she's really passionate about equity, diversity, and inclusion, and she also wrote one of our guest posts that is up on the City of Learners website, so if you want to check that out, it's a great read. And we also had Andrew Parker, who is a former professional basketball player, a coach, and an educator with Edmonton Public Schools at Emmy Lazert. And he's also the co-founder of the Black Teachers Association of Alberta, which I believe was founded this year. And he also spoke at the rally, the Black Lives Matter rally earlier this year. And he has a really beautiful, passionate speech that he shared at the rally. We also had Dr. Farha Shariff, who is a professor in the Department of Secondary Education at the University of Alberta. And her research really specializes in anti-racist pedagogy and cultural identity. So this is something that she studies, and her job, as she says, is to make people uncomfortable. And she really pushes her students to think about how they approach schooling and teaching, and look at it through a lens of a racialized lens. And next we have Irfan Chaudhry, who is a hate crimes researcher and the director of the Office of Human Rights, Diversity and Equity at MacEwan University. And he was kind of a dual role participant and moderator. So he kind of guided the conversation along, and we were really appreciative of the role that he took in making sure the conversation flowed really well. So those were our panelists.
You had mentioned that we do have a blog up on our website from one of the presenters that everybody's about to hear from. Are there other resources, I guess anti-racism resources, that people can check out after they listen to this conversation?
Yes, there are some great resources that will be shared by the panelists during the discussion. And some of the things I wanted to highlight are How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi, which many people have probably heard of, and it's available through the library. Another great text is 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act by Bob Joseph, which really gives us the anti-Indigenous racism perspective. And we also have lots of blog posts and reading lists on our City of Learners page. So if you go to epl.ca/City of Learners, there are a few different blog posts with lots of resources. And if reading is not how you want to learn about this, there's also documentaries on Canopy and on nfb.ca too. A great one is Remember Africville, which is available through NFB. And another one that I really enjoyed reading is When Black People Are in Pain, White People Join Book Clubs, which is an article that was written by Trey Johnson for the Washington Post. And I just really, really like that article, and I recommend it to everybody.
Of course, as with all of our episodes, we will have links to everything that Melanie just mentioned, and also the panelists will as well in today's show notes. So it'll be a great list. So definitely check that link out in your show notes section. So without further ado, we present to you a conversation about racism in Canada.
All right, so let me introduce tonight's speakers. First of all, you may have read on the event description that we would be joined by Veronica Fuentes, who is Anishinaabe tied to Treaty 4 Yellow Quill First Nation and a second-generation Salvadoran. But unfortunately, she's not able to join us tonight, so she sends her regrets, and we hope that we'll be able to have her share her perspective with us in a future event. And next up, we have Andrew Parker. Andrew is a former professional basketball player. He is a Golden Bears basketball alumni, a 20-year basketball coach, an educator with Edmonton Public Schools, and the co-founder of Black Teachers Association of Alberta. Andrew, welcome, and thank you for
welcome, guys. Good to see you.
Next up, we have Dr. Farha Shariff, who is an intersectional feminist and unapologetic social justice educator. She is the daughter of immigrants and mom to 3 bossy women who will run the world one day. She is a professor at the U of A. Her areas of research include anti-racist and anti-oppressive pedagogy, cultural identity, hybridity, power, and privilege. And she is an assistant lecturer in the departments of secondary education and educational policy studies at the U of A. Her main role is to work with pre-service teachers in their understanding of culture, race, schooling, and curriculum. So welcome, Farha. Next up, we have Rochelle Ignacio, who is a safety and inclusion specialist who is passionate about equity, diversity, and inclusion. She has a Bachelor of Science in Human Ecology from the University of Alberta, with a major in family ecology and a minor in community diversity, as well as an occupational health and safety certificate. She strongly believes in community building, volunteerism, and advocating for marginalized individuals and groups of people. Welcome, Rochelle.
Hi, thank you.
And finally, we have our conversation moderator tonight, Irfan Chaudhry, who is a hate crimes researcher and the director of the Office of Human Rights, Diversity, and Equity at MacEwan University. He was a former race relations specialist for the Racism Free Edmonton Project and a co-founder of the Mosquers, a video competition for local Muslim youth. Irfan currently sits on Public Safety Canada's expert committee on countering radicalization to violence. So thank you all so much for being here, and Irfan, over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Melanie, and everyone for joining us today. So, really excited to be a part of this discussion with Rochelle, Andrew, and Farha, and also the rest of you. So, really what we're trying to achieve with today's discussion is really getting an understanding of what we've been seeing and hearing and observing over the last number of weeks and months. And then collectively, folks that have been involved in anti-racism work, either locally, nationally, or internationally, really trying to reaffirm what some of the things that have been talked about in those circles for a very long time. Now it's more open. Now it's more out there. You're seeing a lot more commitments and statements from different, universities, organizations, municipalities, governments, starting to talk about anti-racism, starting to talk about anti-Black racism. You've seen all the major sports leagues put out statements. You'll watch, the NBA games, and they'll have Black Lives Matter on the court. The NHL, which is one really interesting to consider because of the discomfort caused by discussing even racism in a majority white sport, talking about racism, having a Hockey Diversity Alliance, having the hashtag We Skate for Black Lives kind of, all over their arenas. And so this is very, very top of mind for everyone. But I think the biggest challenge that we see, and I know the folks around the table who have joined us today and even the panelists will share, is, we don't want this to just kind of be a momentum shift that is the flavor of the month and then disappears. And now those that have been doing the work are kind of left with added pressure, added responsibilities, and less resources to do the work that people have been committing to. And so this is kind of where we're hoping to situate this conversation today. So, we really have to look at how a lot of these public statements, from a various a number of areas, and I include my own university, MacEwan, put out a statement, and, it was received with, the fanfare that it should have been in terms of its lack of commitment. And other universities also had similar approaches too. But what can we look at in terms of this lack of action, and maybe how it's even broadly connected to certain denials of racial discrimination, a willful ignorance of racial discrimination in the Canadian context? We oftentimes, and I'll kind of start off with the first question here, we'll start off with Farha. We often see how Canadians, might believe that our country does not have a history of racism and racial discrimination. So maybe we'll start with you just to maybe reflect on this question.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I would go as far as to say that the myth that of Canada as being a land in which human rights are always protected and valued and deeply respected is so deeply ingrained in the minds of Canadians. It's become so hard to detect because some of the deeply racist things that have happened in our history, people often don't know about them or don't see them as being problematic. When in fact, it's actually a refusal to acknowledge that Canada has a racist history. I wouldn't even say that people have a hard time believing it. I think there are some Canadians out there that just don't want to believe that. And I wanted to talk a little bit about policy and how there are examples you can look at Canada's past, which is readily observable with regards to legislation that's been implemented over the course of Canada's history. Some quick examples include Black Canadians in the early 19th centuries, the Black Loyalists who entered into Nova Scotia as free people were subject to racist policies. The Indian Act of 1876 and its current version still stands. Canada is the only nation with such a racist, blatantly racist, policy and law that was created by the Canadian government. Chinese Canadians, Japanese Canadians. There are so many examples of racism that's been deeply ingrained in policy. And why it's so important to focus on policy is that when we hear the word race or racism or systemic racism, all of the terms we're going to talk about today, we often think about people and individuals, when really that shifts the focus from what is really important, which is policy. And it's a term that cuts right to the core of racism. Racial discrimination is an immediate and visible manifestation of an underlying racial policy. And when someone discriminates against a person in a racial group, they're often carrying out a policy or taking advantage of the lack of a policy or protective policy. When we focus on racial discrimination, we shift the focus from the central agents of racism, which is racist policy and the racist policymakers, otherwise known as racist power. So we have a long and sordid history with racism in Canada.
Yeah, and I think you raised some interesting points in terms of how it gets ingrained even within policy and processes, and the historical outline I think is key, because oftentimes I think in my own work, especially working with students in university, sometimes that history is either not taught to them earlier on. They're unfamiliar with that history, and I think that kind of also raises the awareness around what might be missing in that context. And I was talking to folks who are involved in the school system, especially having probably first had knowledge on this. So maybe Andrew, just in terms of your role in what you see, maybe reflecting on that same question and how it connects to the work you do as an educator. And I know you even started an organization connected around Black identity and teachers, and maybe just reflect a bit on that question and how it shows up in the work that you try to do.
Yeah, I definitely want to also address what Farha had talked about initially about even just the history of Canada. For the longest time in education, you talk about the founding nations of this country, they mentioned France, they mentioned Britain, but for some reason, for whatever reason it was, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit cultures have been left or excluded from that history. And I think in recent years, even in my lifetime, just seeing how much we've actually grown as a country to acknowledge the contributions historically by First Nations, Métis, and Inuit cultures is incredible. However, we still have such a far way to go. Farha talked about the Indian Act and how First Nations women, even when I teach as a teacher, First Nations women lost their heritage if they decided to marry outside of the culture. And it's not even 20, 30 years, whatever it was, that they were able to go back and say, okay, I have children who I had with a potential Caucasian man, and I lost my heritage, and I have to fight to get the heritage back through the institution that took that away from me from the very beginning. And even if we talk about the residential schooling system, I want to say in the 1990s, mid-1990s, that was when the last residential school was shut down in this country. 1990s, guys. That was when I was in junior high. So these are things that we should be talking about right now. You alluded to the Black Teachers Association, which I am one of the co-founders with Sarah Adamakwanta, Mr. Patrick Powell, as well as Gail Wilson. We had to basically start this association because we felt that for a number of years, African Canadians particularly, were not getting representation, communication, inclusion, and racism awareness, networking, and job opportunities in education here in our province. So basically talking about the history of racism, I think Canada has a far way to go. Of course, in many regards, I don't want to say better, but we've addressed things through truth and reconciliation a little bit better than some other countries, but we still need to do the work on the ground level to address racism and discrimination in this province and in this country.
Yeah, very well said, Andrew, in terms of, some of the gaps that we have. I even, reflecting on, my own experience. So I moved to Canada when I was 5 years old. So for the most part, I was brought up and raised in the Canadian context environment, went to school here in Edmonton. And I can honestly say I didn't hear or learn about even the residential schooling system until I got to university, right? So this is a huge missed gap, I would say, in my own kind of, educational experience of not being exposed to some of the information even further. And so I think maybe going to Rochelle, reflecting on that same question where we have, Canadians maybe either denying, not believing, or, however else we want to say of that willful ignorance of our history of racism and racial discrimination. What's your thoughts on that? What do you see or what do you hear in the work that you do, both, at your organization and also just as a activist in Edmonton?
Thank you. I want to go back to what Farha said about policy and the fact that Canada was even formed on colonialism. So to say that we don't have racism, to me, is an oxymoron. And Farha mentioned a lot of great policies that show the racism that we have. A few more that I want to mention is Africville, where they bulldozed an entire community for a land use that they never even ended up using for that intended purpose. And then even when you look at recent policies, Bill 1 right here in Alberta, the Critical Infrastructure Bill, they built that, in my opinion, in respect to the Indigenous land claims against pipelines. So to say that we don't have racial policies happening to this day is a it's a blatant lie. I was going to say understatement, but I think it's a lie. So I actually interviewed different Black community members recently, and I asked them about their experiences with racism. And what I found was that people who grew up in Toronto, they were more likely to have overt racism happen, such as police brutality, whereas people that were growing up in Alberta had more microaggressions. So that question of, where are you from? Can I touch your hair? Being followed around in a store. And I was born in a small town in Alberta, and I myself had more of that microaggression racism, but I did see that overt racism against our Indigenous population, such as Andrew had mentioned. And I think that still continues today, and it happens everywhere from individuals to our government systems and policies. And I think that we need to start looking at how we take these performative actions that we're currently seeing of people acknowledging racism on social media, and we're starting to get better at calling out racism. But I really think that we're really at the ground floor in the beginning of the racial justice movement and the work of dismantling those systems.
Yeah, I think that's a really fair point that you make. And as you were speaking, you know, those everyday forms of racism and racial discrimination that people of color experience on a daily basis in Canada and elsewhere, you know, that was one of the reasons that, you know, some of the work I've done with the Alberta Hate Crimes Committee, for example, and starting that Stop Hate AB hate incident reporting tool, is because oftentimes what we're finding is these hate motivated incidents that don't necessarily meet the threshold of crime or criminal action, so that limits police involvement, weren't being documented or collected anywhere. And so when you have kind of that gap, it's almost as if these incidents aren't happening. And so since this website's been up and running, and we have different validation and vetting processes to ensure that the information being shared is as accurate as possible, I'd say over half of the reports that we receive are always based on race and or ethnicity as the motive. And the most common act is those everyday forms of racial discrimination. So someone walking down the street, minding their own business, going to check their mailbox, let's say, car drives right by them, rolls down the window, shouts a racial slur at the person, and then continues on with the day. And those are the pieces when I think I go back to some conversations, you know, hearing all of you panelists talk about, is where we see policy and where policy can be strong in a negative way, as you've all outlined, but also where there's policy gaps and where we have that collective movement of being able to try to identify what those spaces are. You know, again, in the realm I occupy, I've observed that biggest gap is around how policing can get involved in hate incidents versus hate crimes, but then also seeing how it falls apart. Just today, we're seeing a report come through where the Edmonton Police Service is now going to be referring a recent homicide investigation to a third party to review, because the judge in their assessment of how the investigation was conducted was certain and even confident, and without saying as much, that there was racial bias that might have fueled the initial investigation. And so when you look at it from those points of perspectives, I think this is what makes the challenge from the Canadian context is, you know, when you hear about racial discrimination, you hear people talk about racial discrimination, it's often that overt stuff that people might be referring to, right? So now even with social media, for example, you're able to get more and more people capture something on camera and post it online and now shared, and then it gets viral. And, you know, in Calgary, for example, they had that recent incident where, you know, an Asian couple was walking in the park. One was on a scooter, and a man, you know, rode by on a skateboard, spit on the woman, called her a racial slur. Within hours, this was circulating online. Within another handful of hours, the person was identified and arrested, and now potential hate crime charges are being processed. So you see those aspects of how technology is being able to kind of, you know, provide some accountability in that everyday forms, but it's more of those, you know, discrete, systemic, institutional, those underlying ones where a policy might be enacted for one reason, and the ones that you just talked about are very obvious in terms of their reasons being enacted. But now we're seeing more and more policies come through that it might inadvertently impact students and racialize students, right? And, you know, going back to the conversation that many of you might be familiar with earlier this year with the Catholic school, right? And the case of the 11-year-old boy, Emmanuel, who was wearing a do-rag at school. And as a young Black child, he now gets isolated by his school leaders and school resource officer that a do-rag could potentially be connected to gang affiliation. And then we saw the fallout that happened from there. And so these are the examples that I think are very complex and challenging to try to even administer and address, because you have what some academics call racism without racists, right? So you have those racist acts, but because they're ingrained in policy, they're ingrained in institutions, you don't have someone who keep it accountable, right? And so this is where I kind of want to go to the next question. I think Farha, your hand was up, but in the spirit of equity, I'm going to start with Rochelle, but we'll definitely get to you. So Rochelle, maybe start off answering this question. There's been a lot of attention paid to the concept of systemic racism in light of recent events. So, much of some of the examples we've brought up, systemic racism includes the policies and practices entrenched in established institutions, which result in the exclusion or promotion of designated groups. It differs from overt discrimination in that no individual intent is necessary. So, in terms of that definition, in terms of the examples all of us have kind of brought up right now, how do we help raise awareness and education about the real impacts of systemic racism?
So I think that we need to start openly discussing these racist acts, whether they are the microaggressions or the overt forms, and even examples such as carding in Edmonton, or talking about the 60s scoop that occurred and the fallout from that. I think that conversations such as what we're having tonight play a role in creating that awareness and education. And we need to really acknowledge that when a marginalized person takes the time and energy to talk about these discussions, there is a mental and emotional labor component that goes with that. So taking the time, even for myself, if a different racialized group is speaking about their concepts or their community perspectives or their traumas, that I stop and listen and I reflect on how my actions or my lack of actions help contribute to the overall systemic racism and the cycle of that. Another thing that I think is relevant to address would be that concept of a seat at a table. And so I had this discussion with my friend recently, and he had read an article where, I'll re-paraphrase what he told me, is that when you have to fight for a seat at the table, that seat was never, and that table was never ours to begin with. So I think that we need to start looking at how we deconstruct these metaphoric tables, whether it's an advisory panel or a board or your system of government, and think of it in a broad sense. So at your different levels, from your community, municipal, provincial, federal, even your international levels, and start questioning, does the table represent the community that it's serving? And if it's not, then we need to start questioning why. And I think that through that discussion, we can use our voice. So by voting in who we want to elect us and those parties that represent our values, writing your politicians or decision makers, signing petitions. There's lots of little tangible actions that we can take, and when we do them as a collective, they have more of an impact and more of a voice.
Yeah, and just in regards to that table analogy, I've heard folks say, if you can't find a seat at the table, bring your own chair, right? And so I think these are pieces where we kind of have to be working within those systems sometimes, but if the system isn't working, then that's where we need to bring our own chair and maybe disrupt things. And so, Andrew, maybe just building off what Rochelle just talked about, you had referenced in your earlier answer, the reason you started that Black Teachers Association was because you observed that there was that gap in terms of, you referenced networking opportunities, mentorship opportunities, things that are really integral, especially at the junior high and high school level, to help equip and empower young students to, go down a path that will help build their skill set. And so maybe just reflecting on that, how you might acknowledge or raise awareness when there might be a denial again of the impacts of systemic racism, and maybe to go a little bit further, how can or should we respond when systemic racism and more broadly systemic discrimination is denied, even as a concept that has real life implications?
Well, first of all, there's a few different ways that I want to address this question. I loved your analogy about if there's not a chair at the table, bring your chair. With the Black Teachers Association, we not only want to bring our chair, we want to bring our own table. It's been such a long time. We literally had to go back and do so much research and the preliminary discussions of the Black Teachers Association, we had to go and talk to teachers who have been there for 25, 30 years and ask them these questions like, why haven't we started a Black Teachers Association then? What were some of the hindrances? Who was ready to support us? Who was obviously or incredibly silent during times of struggles within our community? Even for myself as a teacher, like I started out as a basketball coach. That was my whole into becoming a teacher. And then now in the last 2 to 3 years with Black Lives Matter being a student group in our school, and seeing that the students were much braver and courageous than a lot of adults, and in a very interesting time in society, adults that were Black, white, or otherwise. It was really important for me as a teacher to not only listen to them, but to support them and to sit in on those meetings and to volunteer myself as a teacher mentor. Because I knew for a fact that, unfortunately, if there were no Black teachers in certain places or different schools, that these kids wouldn't have any opportunities to speak about what it's even like to be a Black student or to be an ethnic minority. I think we need more teachers to come out of their shells and to become allies. Ally work right now is one of the greatest things that can happen as far as bringing reconciliation, as far as listening to personal testimonies, and as far as tackling systemic racism in schools and many other institutions. The way that I feel about the Black Teachers Association is, if we cannot reach certain avenues, we need to go higher. We need to talk higher. And if the higher we go, people are still not listening, then we need to build our own infrastructure. And that's where we were with the Black Teachers Association. Currently, there are so many members within that association, Black people, allies, Caucasians, etc., people from various different ethnic minorities that are willing to do the work and understand full well going into this association that there will be hindrances, but we are not deterred, and we're going to try our very best to, like I said, not only bring our chair, but bring our own table to the discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. And I think one of the things I kind of picked up from what you were talking about is, that idea around there might be hindrances. And I think when we reflect on hindrances in the work of anti-racism, that's sometimes framed as resistance, that's sometimes framed as, you're going too far, so to speak, and this kind of goes to Farha, maybe you can build off of this idea. It also goes towards discomfort and people being uncomfortable with the concept of racism and racial discrimination, right? No one wants to be called a racist. No one wants to say they work for a racist institution. But if you critically assess and look at the things that all of us are a part of, regardless of what organization we belong to, there are racist practices we might inadvertently still be continuing to be promoting because of the way it's been set up as a system. So maybe Farha, I'll maybe have that last part of the question for you in terms of where you kind of see the concept of systemic racism either being denied and how you respond when you see that denial, and then more broadly, how do we respond when people deny?
Thank you for that. And Rochelle and Andrew, I feel so honored to sit on this panel with you guys, because you're so, it's like we're all connected, the same brain, same wavelength. And we just want to kind of vibe off each other. So I start every single course. It doesn't matter what level or what I'm teaching. And it doesn't even have to be about race and racism. And I write on the whiteboard or I type in the Zoom box, what does a racist look like? And my students kind of sit there like quiet. They don't really say anything. So we unpack the terms racist and anti-racist and systemic racism and all of those things all semester. So the terms racist and anti-racist, they're not fixed identities that you can switch back and forth between being a racist and being an anti-racist. And it doesn't matter what color your skin is or anything. Anybody has the capacity to be racist, because you can switch back and forth, and it determines what we are, not who we are. So I'll say that again. It determines what we are, not who we are, because we've often been taught or socialized to believe that racist is a pejorative term, or it's disparaging, or it's derogatory, or it's a belittling adjective, as opposed to thinking like it's basically a slur. If someone says, well, that was racist, or that's a racist, thing to say, we take that as a slight and we take that as a personal attack. Like, I don't like you. Instead, we need to think about it as being a descriptive and very informative term, because the only way to undo racism is to constantly examine it, self-reflect, call it out, attempt to dismantle it, and it requires that dichotomy of going back and forth between self-reflection and action. So really, anybody has the capacity to be racist. Like, all of us have the capacity to be racist. It's been socialized into us. We see it on TV. It's all of these normalizing factors we've been talking about all evening. It's so hard to pinpoint what exactly is and isn't racist unless it's overt. So, for example, we're either racist or anti-racist. There's no such thing as I'm not racist. So you're either a racist or an anti-racist. The opposite of racist is anti-racist. It's not a racist. Because if you say I'm not a racist, you're assuming a neutral position. And quite frankly, neutrality is, or denial is a mask for racism. So, for example, we'll all call out a certain president's actions as being racist, but very, very seldomly are we able to look at some of the thoughts and considerations, or perhaps actions or words that we ourselves have used, and call ourselves or call out ourselves as something that we've done or said or believed as being racist, right? So being an anti-racist requires constant self-reflection, action, and a commitment to go back and forth. The other thing that's really important to kind of mention is we have to simplify terms, because you would be shocked at how many people don't actually understand what the term racism means or what a racist means. And so going back to policy, the term systemic or institutionalized racism ends up being kind of redundant, because racism itself is structural, it's systemic, it's institutional. And when we talk about racist policy, we are looking exactly at some of those structures that are in place in society that make it so hard to pick apart what is being inequitable. So inequity between two or more racial groups. So policy includes things like unwritten laws, rules, procedures, processes, regulations, guidelines, I would argue curriculum that govern people. And I'm going to say something bold, which I'm used to doing on a daily basis, that there is no such thing as a non-racist or race-neutral policy. Every policy in every institution, in every community, in every nation is producing or sustaining either racial inequity or equity between racial groups. And the only way we can remedy it, it's either to be anti-racist and actively look for, actively self-examine, actively look at some of the policies, procedures, all those things that I mentioned. Because when someone discriminates against a person in a racial group, they are carrying out a policy or taking advantage, like I said, of the lack of protective policy. And I'll just end by saying we all, every single one of us, have the power to discriminate. Only an exclusive few have the power to make policy. So focusing on racial discrimination sometimes takes our eyes off the central agents of racism, which is racist policy and racist policymakers.
Yeah, really well said and well explained. And I think as you're speaking, it just reminded me of the work of Ibram X. Kendi, who came out with that book, what was it, a couple of years back, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And, you know, he really talks about a lot of what Farha was just really articulating for us in terms of, you know, even looking at the work of anti-racism upon a spectrum, right? And so you have, you know, some might be framed under a segregationist type of a policy framework. Most, I would argue, would be framed around an assimilationist type of a framework. And then you have a broader framework of anti-racism. Absolutely, that's the book right there. This is a must read, I would say, in terms of being a paradigm shift, because what it allows you to do in terms of the framework that Ibram kind of explains is we all have to acknowledge that racism that we are, you know, exhibiting ourselves and also inadvertently promoting ourselves, because again, it doesn't go back to individual actions. It speaks back more broadly to those systemic policy pieces. And, you know, just in terms of some of the complexity of this, you know, some of you folks, I'm not sure the roles you occupy professionally, but you might be called to investigate, you know, a workplace harassment complaint where there is allegations of racial discrimination. And oftentimes what you hear is, you know, oh, that person could have never done that. They're not racist at all. And so that's, again, going back to Farah's point, well, it's not a matter of the person as an individual, it's how those actions, part of that systemic piece that's being referred to, has racial impacts and racialized impacts and racist impacts on individuals. And so oftentimes you're seeing more and more case law even come forward of trying to really shake up and disrupt the way that you know, complaints around racial discrimination have been conducted in recent years. It's often, you know, well, if it happened, prove it. And that's not necessarily the best way to do that, right? Because again, it goes back to stuff that even Rochelle and Andrew were speaking about earlier, putting extra onus on racialized bodies to once again prove that they were discriminated against. And again, we just have to look at recent events that have been caught on camera, posted online. Those everyday racism are real pieces that people experience. So I think one of the things I want to reflect on now, and we'll kind of shift gears a little bit, you know, take a little bit more personal reflection for all of you, if that's okay. And I think, Andrew, I haven't started with you first, so I think I'll go to you first on this one. So really just share as much as you feel comfortable. You know, we all come to this work from different personal experiences, and, you know, maybe have been shaped by a specific moment, a specific experience, a specific idea, or another form of inspiration that strengthened your commitment to anti-racism work. So maybe if you don't mind reflecting on if there was any one thing or moments that kind of, you know, reaffirmed your commitment around anti-racism work and the work that you currently do.
Well, literally a month ago, one of the most important moments of my life as a teacher, as an Edmontonian and even as a Black man, was when we had the Black Lives Matter protest here in the city of Edmonton. The only reason I was there, I'm not going to say it's the only reason, I would have attended anyways, but the only reason I was able to be there as someone providing a speech was because two of my former students, and I have to give them a shout out right now, Isan and Sabana Mohammed, from Emmy Lizard High School. They were the co-presidents of the Black Lives Matter student group at our school. They had asked me, you know, Mr. Parker, would you be willing to come and stand with us at the Black Lives Matter protest and march? And initially coming into that, I did not know some of the other organizers, but I did know the Black Lives Matter group. I did know Belen Samino, who's like the prez of that association. And I had a 1 hour conversation with her the Thursday night. Friday night would have been the protest, but the Thursday night, she talked to me for 1 hour. And after that 1 hour conversation, they had asked if I would want to speak as well as stand with these students. I took about 30 minutes to an hour. I wrote a speech out. I rehearsed it for 3 hours. And the very next day, I went on the stage. Now, the difference between the way I rehearsed that speech was if, volume levels 1 would be quiet and 10 would be loud. When I was rehearsing that speech, I was probably at a level 3, just, very calm, speaking about certain things that were happening in the community. When I went on that stage and I saw 15,000 Edmontonians in one place in the legislative grounds during COVID-19, during all the pandemic talk and all of that stuff, I literally went from 3, or what Drake would say, 0 to 100 real quick. And the passion came out of me to speak out for the culture. And of course, through my experiences as a teacher, as a boy, as an athlete, as a human being who grew up different. And that moment right there was profound for me because it was 2 young ladies, young, strong females, Black females, who literally in that moment, I forgot they were my students, and I started to think about them as my daughters. And I asked myself, if my daughter had asked me that question, 20 years from now, hey, Dad, I'm going to go give a speech, and I need your support. I would have turned the car on, opened the garage up, made her a sandwich or whatever, and we're in that car, and we're going to that place, and we're going to talk about what's happening. Now, my hope, even when I was saying that speech, was that, 20 years from now, we don't have to do that. 10 years from now, we don't have to do that. 5 years from now, we don't have to do that. So me speaking at that moment in front of my fellow citizens in the city of Edmonton, that was a life changer. That was a game changer. And it changed me as a human being from being one type of a teacher to knowing exactly what type of work I want to do from now to the end of my career for my community and for all marginalized communities, ethnic minorities, and of course, the greater public and society in the city of Edmonton.
Wow, very, very powerful. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think it's amazing, that experience you just talked about. And, even referring back to that, I'm assuming it was that main protest that happened at the Ledge Grounds, where I never thought in my lifetime I'd see 15,000 Edmontonians show up for an anti-racism rally. And I think that in itself, if I didn't have 3 young kids at home, I would have been there as well. But it's one of those things where it's amazing to see kind of that groundswell of support, but also more broadly, the voices speaking that change is needed like ASAP, right? And I think that speaks volumes in terms of what we've heard and seen. So thanks so much for sharing that. Farha, maybe I'll throw the same question to you in terms of, any moment, experience, idea, or other form of inspiration that may have strengthened your commitment to, anti-racism work and the work that you currently do.
Thank you. Andrew, I watched your speech and I was like yelling at we watched it virtually because I have elderly parents and I wasn't able to go to the rally, but so you were incredible. My entire life I'll quote the words of Jagmeet Singh, NDP leader. My entire life is an act of resistance. So my parents were immigrants to Edmonton in the early 1960s. My dad came from Pakistan and my mom came from Uganda. They were both young students and met and fell in love at Lister Hall at the U of A. And they, back in the, mid to late 60s, that's when, multicultural policy, late 70s, mid 70s, ended up being a little bit kind to new immigrants, I think. But let me tell you, I grew up in St. Albert. It was a very, very white community. I often ask my parents all the time, why did you pick St. Albert? We were one of maybe 4 visible minority families in St. Albert in the early 70s, late 70s, early 80s. And my entire life, I experienced racism from small microaggressions to physical aggression towards me. I, in fact, wrote a book about it. I wrote my master's dissertation about my experiences growing up in St. Albert as a student. And the one thing about being the victim of racism, whether it's a microaggressive behavior or physical violence, is that racism has a way of making you feel less than or inferior. And, we could get into different theories about the self and the other, but, I grew up wanting to be nothing but white, and I felt so uncomfortable in the skin that I was in that I just wanted to be normal. I just wanted to blend in. And it took going to graduate school right out of undergrad. I took a couple courses with the infamous Dr. Patrick Solomon over at York University, who has now since passed, and Dr. Carl James. And I started to understand the dynamics of identity and racial identity and othering and so on and so forth. And I did, my master's dissertation was all about that self-excavation. It was a narrative inquiry into my own experiences and struggles with race and racism. It was very therapeutic to go back into my memories and bring up some of the stuff that I had repressed, and I was able to deal with it. And then later on in life, I was blessed with 3 young girls. I did my master's work in racial equity, and I moved back to Edmonton, and I was being interviewed by a very large school board that will remain unnamed. And when I was being interviewed, they said, "Oh, what's your graduate work in?" And I said, "Racial equity and systemic racism." And they were like, "Next question." They just moved right along, and that was in the early 2000s. And so I thought, that's not really okay with me. I went into a school system, ironically, the same school that I went to in junior high, and nothing had changed. I was a teacher there for a couple of years, and I thought, this is not, there's more work to be done. So I went back to graduate school, and by then I had 1.5 children and finished my graduate degree, my PhD. I ended up with 3 kids by then, and have never been more committed to make the world a completely different place than the one that I've grown up in. And never did I think that I would witness, like you said, Irfan, a march for racial equality in my lifetime. And so for my children, from the legacy of my parents who came here and taught me you have to be smarter, bigger, faster, stronger than anybody who is white because of the color of your skin. They taught me that education was my currency to get myself up in the world. That immigrant mentality of success very much back in the 60s and 70s hinged on education. And so my entire life has been an act of resistance, and I will continue to educate. My current role is educating young teachers about the histories and atrocities of residential schools, the treatment of Indigenous peoples in Canada, and educating students on what race and racism looks like, so that the world that my kids grow up in can start to look a little bit different than the world that I grew up in.
Yeah, again, thanks again for sharing that personal experience. And I think, connected to what you just talked about, and even Andrew reflecting on the power of our kids, right, in terms of that commitment and further mobilization. So I think that's really powerful to share. Rochelle, same question to you. What moment, experience, idea, or other form of inspiration strengthen your commitment to anti-racism work and the work that you do?
Thank you. So I think that I was just kind of born into this work, honestly. It was high school for me is my most defining moment, where I was trying to find, growing up in a small town, there is limited job opportunities. So there is one large organization, and I really like their diversity and inclusion department. And that was my aspiration, to work within that department. So when I went to university, I took a minor in community diversity. And I will admit that I had a very narrow mindset of what diversity meant. And every single one of my projects, whether it was family finance, like community studies, it was always focused on immigration reform or race. And if anyone wanted to be in my group, that was the topic we had to select, but at least I was smart, so I got away with that. And then I was fortunate, I was elected a diversity and respectful workplace council role. And that is kind of how I came into contact with Irfan, actually, at a community practice event. And that really opened my eyes of what diversity meant. And it's not just about race, it's about gender diversity, sexual orientation, age. There's all these different facets of diversity. And so I started broadening my scope to be, how do we have more diverse organizations? But in the last, 2 months, I would say, there's been that focus on racial justice, and that's always been my passion. And so I'm being guided back into that work. And now I'm being guided more of a community level, which is a different facet than organization. So it's really interesting to me. Going back to what Andrew said with the protests, was I wasn't comfortable going to the protests, hearing there's going to be thousands of people down there. So I came to Red Deer because that's the nearest center where I grew up. And there was hundreds of people in Red Deer. And for me, that I was just blown away by that, because I think to get 10 people to show up to a racial protest when I was growing up would be unheard of. But then you had hundreds of people there. And it was something that I talked to my mom about, like, wow, I can't believe so many people came out and supported this in Red Deer of all places. And yeah, I'm here for the long haul. I don't want this talk of racial justice to be trendy. It's been something I've been working on for a number of years. And so I'm interested, while I was hesitant with everything going on, I had this anxiety of, what does this movement look like? What's going to happen? I have this, I'd say, cautious optimism. And I'm realizing that we can't just change things overnight. And we have to take a slow, methodical approach to how we approach racial justice here in Alberta, here in Canada.
Yeah, again, thanks for sharing that experience. And I think as you're speaking, I share a similar concern in terms of I'm worried as well about the trendiness of racial justice kind of, having its day right now. And then the next flavor of the month inadvertently kind of takes over, and as I kind of alluded to earlier is, we're going to have folks who've been doing this work, either professionally, volunteer-based, advisory-based, whatever it looks like, who've been doing, anti-racism work for, forever, it might seem. And now there's, again, going back to our analogy we use, now there seems to be more and more people who want to attend the table, but I don't want them to take the table away because something else has kind of come up, right? And so I think that's my biggest concern in terms of what I've even heard and seen. So even at my own institution, for example, I've received so many emails, and whether it's from faculty members, students, senior leaders that want to do more around equity, diversity, inclusion, which I think is great. But then I also go back and say, well, I'm a team of one. And, oftentimes you see other resources around equity, diversity, inclusion are also just as understaffed, if staffed at all, because historically this work has always been done on the side of the table. And oftentimes it's at the side of the table from a human resources perspective, which is an important part of equity, diversity, inclusion work, but not the only part, I would say. And just even scanning some of the questions that I've seen kind of pop up, I think that's some of the reflection pieces that we can maybe share when we get into the question and answer period. So just for those folks who are still with us, we're going to kind of I'll do one more question, and then we'll just do a quick wrap up with the panelists, and then I'll turn it back over to Melanie to kind of guide us through the question and answer portion. So I do appreciate everyone who's joined us today and the level of attention and the questions we're seeing so far. And so the last formal question to panelists, and this one, I'll kind of just throw it out there for whoever wants to answer it first. What we've seen is a lot of action now happening from different organizations and institutions that may historically never have even expressed an interest, at least publicly, around addressing racial discrimination. And so you now have a lot of I don't want to name organizations, but I've had a number of different organizations email me over the last few weeks asking for different insights and advice and suggestions on how they and their organization or their board or their membership can start to address racial discrimination in meaningful ways. So I think we've kind of what we've seen happen over the last number of months in Edmonton, I think that protest is a really good example of that, is we've shifted the conversation and go beyond just awareness, and it's now moving to awareness education, but also awareness education and action. And what I often observe is sometimes everyone's willing to be raising awareness around racial discrimination or other forms of discrimination. Some are also willing to take the step forward and make education a part of that process, whether it be through board meetings, whether it be through membership meetings, whether it be through other educational sessions. But then you also see that number kind of fizzle out when it comes to action, right? There was a recent report that was done by one private sector firm where they kind of did a little survey of their membership. And, they're asking their membership, the importance of the value of equity, diversity, inclusion within their organizations. And I'd say about 85 to 90% of the membership answered, yes, equity, diversity, inclusion is a strong value for our organization. But when the question became, well, how much resources are you able to provide, or are you willing to provide, or are you committed to providing to ensure your value for equity, diversity, inclusion is met with, financial resources, that number dwindled down to 30%. Right? So this is where you see that challenge. You have many people speaking out and wanting to get involved, engaged, and act in this realm, but then you have very little that are able to support through resources, right? Again, we're going through really interesting times right now in our province with COVID, with numerous cuts from provincial government and other areas. And we have seen equity, diversity, inclusion offices in various sectors either being reduced or dismantled. And so now we have this really interesting disconnect where there's a strong push for more awareness, more education, more action, and yet this is falling on the shoulders of one person, sometimes half a person because they're splitting their job elsewhere, or going back to what Rochelle had kind of alluded to in her last comment, it now falls down to the community. And I think the power of community, it moves faster than organizations. But then also going back to what Andrew was talking about, there comes a point in time where unfortunately in this work of equity and inclusion and anti-racism, you're always going to be met with resistance along the way. And those resistance pieces oftentimes are gatekeepers. Those gatekeepers are oftentimes connected to positions of power. And now you're at a space where either those leaders get it and allow you to continue, or they don't get it, and now you have to go back to the drawing board and say, okay, how can I, now your work becomes more so trying to convince someone about their discomfort versus doing the actual work. So long story short, even sessions like these that the Edmonton Public Library has hosted for us tonight are a good starting point for, some of these conversations. But this one I'll just kind of throw out there. What role do public institutions such as our libraries or our municipal governments or our universities or our public schools, what role do they play in addressing and confronting racism? So this, I'll just kind of mute my mic, and whoever would like to answer this first, please go ahead.
So at the height of the Black Lives Matter movement, I found myself asking this question specific to the libraries. And it actually I picked up the phone and called EPL during COVID. And I reached a branch manager, and we had a great discussion about what resources were available at the library. And that actually turned into me doing a guest blog for Edmonton Public Library about race and racism. So along my journey, what I've learned is that the library itself is a hub of information and resources. And the challenge is knowing how to navigate, how to find the information that you're after. And so I think that we need to start thinking of these public institutions as being community connectors, because we can't all be experts. An individual can't be an expert, an organization can't be an expert in everything. But what we can do is help connect you to the appropriate body who can get you that information. And so I think that even though your question may not be answered, there's no harm in asking the question, because at least you'll be pointed on your way. And for me, through this experience, I learned about the library lists that Edmonton Public Library has. And I created a list called Let's Talk About Race and Discrimination. And so that, for me, it's nonfiction and fiction books, but it's a way for everybody to get involved and find a way to learn new cultures, learn different perspectives, and try and learn that empathy and understanding. So by using the resources available, it's trying to help people educate themselves.
Farha, do you want to go ahead?
Sure, that's really nice of you, Andrew. Thank you.
No problem.
So I was actually just pulling up a document that I was working on this afternoon. So I think I echo what Rochelle was saying, wholeheartedly, that I believe that materials need to be representative of the contemporary issues that we're facing, these days. I also feel, and I'm not going to get on a soapbox about funding right now to education, but for example, the recent closure of the Coots Library at the U of A is just like, I don't understand how, and cuts to what's happening with education. Teachers are the hub, teachers are the vehicles. We are the agents of socialization of society, that we're creating, doctors, lawyers, custodians, librarians. We are creating these students. And I think, I just think that we are being muzzled. I think that educators are being muzzled. I think public institutions like libraries are being muzzled. I'm going to stop there because I'll just keep going, and this conversation will turn into something completely different. Recently, there was a launch of a Journal of Critical Library and Information Studies, and I'll post the link in the chat box. And it represents a crucial contribution to critical race work within the field of race and racism theory. I think too often we focus on the diversity paradigm, which is important, but as Rochelle acknowledged, it doesn't often address the intersectionalities that come with, critical conversations and critical theory, which is, feminism, ableism, gender studies, LGBTQ plus issues. So the intersectionality of this conversation around equity needs to be recognized. And this journal specifically that I'll post, it kind of captures that under-theorized area of race, because right now there is an overwhelming emphasis on library information studies on the practical and technical side, and we don't often recognize the inquiry into matters of power and going back again into policy. And those kinds of materials need to be available in their own right. So I really think it's important that representative materials from, you know, critical scholars in the field. I'll also address what Rochelle said as well. Not everybody is an expert. I think when it comes to humanities and social sciences, and topics such as race and racism, you know, everybody's uncle is an expert, and or, you know, everybody's brother is an expert, or this happened to me, so this must be true. When what we need to do is actually lean on the research and lean on the data that is being generated, just like we do for other disciplines around science, technology, innovation, environmentalism, those kinds of things. The amount of conversations that I witness on a daily basis, that I literally just sit there and I listen, where people are arguing, you know, issues around race and racism, and they're using, you know, it's like, excuse me, let me interrupt your, you know, your expertise with my, you know, exuberant confidence and opinion. And so, you know, if we make these materials available to the public, they can start educating themselves and into these critical issues of power and policy and privilege and all of the issues that underlie race and racism, instead of just focusing on diversity.
You know, I think that's an interesting point. Andrew, you'll have the last word here, but as Farha was talking, it reminds me, even when I do a lot of kind of data analysis of online narratives in similar scopes of what Farha was just talking about. And it's really interesting the amount of people that will interject and say, well, you know, take your research because I have a friend who's from X racialized background and they said it's okay. And it almost reaffirms like a negative stereotype and reaffirms a stereotypical perspective. And it's really interesting to kind of see that hold more weight sometimes. And I've seen this even on LinkedIn, which is supposed to be like that professional setting where you'd hope that, you know, data and research would guide people's comments, but no one's immune from the comment section, I guess. So Andrew, we'll turn it over to you in terms of that question, in terms of the role public institutions play in addressing and confronting racism.
Well, on a personal level, I have to give a shout out to our school's librarian and teacher, Harold Selmanek, who was very, very, very progressive in his mindset in terms of bringing in books from African Canadian novelists, journalists, a number of different, you name it, encyclopedias, autobiographies, etc., were brought to our school through EPL, actually. In fact, I have 3 of those books that he brought in my own bookshelf at my school. One of them is The History of Protest. The other one is the autobiography of Malcolm X, which is a hot book in our school at Emily High School, which is about 50 to 60% ethnic minorities, maybe even more than that. And the other one was Let Freedom Reign. So he basically went out of his way as a teacher librarian to find that information, to bring it to our teachers, to bring it to our students. He sent us an email as soon as it came in. And as soon as it came in, I took both of my classes, 36, 37 students in both of those classes. We went down to the library. I suggested that to our students. The students were able to find novels that had that representation. Not only that, they were able to read it for leisure, not just for the class, read it so that they could have, you know, that representation for themselves. Like there's a student who got Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's autobiography. And he said, Mr. Parker, this is the first book that I've ever read in my life where I was about somebody who's Black just like me, who's Muslim just like me. And I'm reading it not just because this is happening on this day in terms of assessment, but because I needed it for myself and my soul as a 15, 16-year-old in high school. So in many regards, I think teachers, as well as librarians, et cetera, there needs to be that open dialogue, there needs to be transparency, and there needs to be advocacy. And I think if we're able to do that in our school, there's no question that any of these schools in the province of Alberta and country of Canada, that we can do that on a daily and consistent basis.
That's great. That's so great. And so I guess just in the interest of time, I'm seeing there's quite a bit of activity in the chat screen there. And I do want to give attendees a chance to kind of have any questions they answered. So the last, very quick response, if possible, to all panelists, for folks who have kind of joined us today, who want to expand their anti-racism knowledge and awareness, what resource, what book, toolkit, research, video, movie, etc. Might you recommend folks to have in their repertoire? And, for me, for example, that book that Farha held up earlier, if you don't mind holding it up again, if it's close by, How to Be Anti-Racist, I have found to be very influential and instrumental to where I'm at right now in the work I'm doing, because it's forcing me to kind of reassess and reimagine things in different ways that I might not have been able to do before prior to being exposed to that knowledge. And that only is going to push my work a bit further. So maybe Rochelle, I'll turn that over to you.
I feel like I already answered your question with my last answer, but I was going to mention my book list that I had mentioned, the Let's Talk About Race and Discrimination. I don't know, Cineplex and Netflix, they each had curated lists of different movies that you could watch. And I think taking them for what they are, and not everything is necessarily historically accurate, but trying to immerse yourself that way is an easy way. And then I know that one of my friends, when I was telling her about the list that I created, she was like, well, I don't like to read. And I felt that she wanted me to just explain everything to her. And so my response was, well, there's Audible. So if you don't like reading, there's other ways, movies, Audible, whatever, of going about it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Andrew, anything you want to share in terms of a resource you'd suggest for people to check out?
I gotta give a shout out to this generation, because I feel like Farha had said, in the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of kids in the community of Edmonton that were introduced to immigrant families, to ethnic minorities, in a very important time in history, where at this point in time, now that we're talking about anti-racism, now we're talking about systemic racism, discrimination, there's a lot of people who are allies because they had those friendships. I think what people need to do is not only just look for like books and videos, etc. Is we got to sit down and talk to people. We got to reach out to people and have those conversations. It's different. Like I can sit up here and recite William Shakespeare, Ernest Hemingway, Robert Frost, a number of different authors and say their lines with perfect execution. But at the end of the day, I found that the most profound impact I had in terms of race relations was by talking to human beings and sitting down and asking them questions and allowing them to ask me questions. Like, which words do you prefer? How do you view yourself in today's society? What is it like being a teacher of color? What is it like being an athlete of color? If people don't have those human interactions, they're going to assume that certain things are okay or should be condoned. But if you have those conversations, you can understand another side of the world, and potentially you could change the world. So I think in addition to books and videos and other resources, we need to sit down and talk to one another and have these uncomfortable conversations until we can become a whole society as opposed to a divided society.
That's great. And for our same question before we turn it back over to Melanie for the Q&A.
Thank you. I just actually ran and opened a box because we just moved, and I had all my fall 2020 materials. So the first one, Ibram, Dr. Kendi, his book is incredible. A lot of my notes today were taken from this book. It's very American in context, but a lot of what he talks about is salient, for any context. There's another one called So You Want to Talk About Race by Oluo. This is a really good one. It's very accessible. Some of, again, very Americanized, but is really like a good seminal text. I would recommend those two for sure. This one is definitely, if you're a person of color, Black or Indigenous, don't travel on a plane with this. I did that once and it wasn't very comfortable. So I was sitting beside someone and reading this. This is definitely, it's not for the faint of heart. It gets really, it digs deep. And if you're not ready to jump in with both feet just yet, maybe save this one and read this one as your third or fourth text. For two Canadian texts, 21 Things You Didn't Know About the Indian Act. This is an excellent text to talk about the Indian Act. It's very, it's very approachable. There's a couple of different discussions online. There's a CBC clip that you can look into. Indigenous Rights by Chelsea Vowell, also an excellent text, very conversational. I love her writing style. She's excellent. So this is another really good text. I could go on all day doing this. There's another one called All Our Relations by Tanya Talaga. This is not for the faint of heart as well. It's definitely provocative. An excellent text talking about finding the path forward. It's a CBC Massey Lectures. It's a book that she penned that go with the Massey Lectures. And if you're interested, and if you don't love theory, like, everybody loves theory, there's two other books that I would recommend, that are Canadian. One is called Indian Horse. There is a movie adaptation that I don't believe is as good as the book, but Indian Horse is another really good one to give you a glimpse and a feeling into what residential schools were like. And if you prefer poetry, there is another book called Embers by Richard Wagamies. Indian Horse is also by Richard Wagamies. We'll stop there.
Perfect. So really great resources. I see other folks have also posted resources in the chat screen, and I see that EPL will be kind of sharing some resources. So this is all great. And so I'll turn it back over to Melanie to kind of guide us through any questions that she's observed, but maybe I will kind of take the first one. Andrew, we've had some questions about what the full quote of your t-shirt says. So to kind of stop the suspension, maybe let people know what's on your shirt and how they might get one.
Okay, first and foremost, I wear this shirt every Black History Month, the beginning of February at our school. I actually bought two of these shirts for Isan and Sabana, those two amazing students I told you who brought me to the Black Lives Matter protest. The shirt says this: dream like Martin, lead like Harriet, fight like Malcolm, think like Garvey, write like Maya, build like Madam CJ, speak like Frederick, they're referring to Frederick Douglass, educate like W.E.B. Du Bois, believe like Thurgood Marshall, challenge like Rosa Parks, and of course, finally, one of my favorite guys in the world is inspire like Barack Obama. This is just my Black History Month shirt, and I honestly really love it. And if any of you guys want to know how to get one, just leave my email here in this chat, and I will send that to you. So yeah, I love this shirt. I wear it all the time, and yeah, I think it's important that our youth, and not only that, our teachers in our school are aware of some of the heroes that we don't get a chance to talk about every day in our classes. I mean, we spend a significant amount of time talking about Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin and all these, European leaders, but when do we ever get a chance to talk about some of the other leaders, especially from my culture? So shout out to everyone in the chat who wanted to know who's in there. I'm just making sure you see it. I'm definitely not trying to show off my chest, I promise. Great.
Thank you. Yes, that was going to be my first question. How do we get your shirt? Great. Yeah, this was a super interesting conversation, and there are some interesting questions in the comments. So maybe we'll start with a question about the demographics of certain types of jobs. So why do certain types of jobs attract certain demographics? And then maybe as a follow-up, how do we, where does the process of diversifying these jobs that are maybe, not so diverse, where does that start?
I'll take the first part of the question, and I think that it has to do with what we mentioned at the beginning, it's policy. So when we had a labor shortage during our economic boom, we actually recruited newcomers to perform certain types of jobs. And they were jobs that Canadians didn't want to fulfill because there was higher paying jobs for them. And then we look at the credential system and how credentials aren't recognized on an international level. And so then we have this concept of doctors and engineers doing lower class jobs such as driving an Uber or a taxi. And I don't know what the answer is beyond policy reform. So I'll maybe leave that to the other panelists to fill in, but that's my take on it.
Yeah, and maybe if I can just add on to Rochelle's point there, I think that kind of showcases the legacy of policy, right? Because when you go back and allude to, my parents came to Canada based on the point system at that time that was based on immigration applications. And, having, certain status, from their home country And then coming here, dad had to kind of be an entrepreneur, and mom had to kind of find, administration work that would fit with her skill set, all with the hopes for a better life for, their children. And so I think when you go back to some of those pieces of, assumptions around why certain jobs and demographics and all those aspects, it does kind of connect to those pieces that Rochelle talked about. But again, this also kind of showcases those systemic pieces that we've been kind of referencing in terms of how pipelines of opportunities are accessible for some and not others. And so even going back to Andrew's comment around, mentorship as a key component for building opportunities of networking and pipelines for students of various backgrounds to be exposed to networks is key. And there's been a lot of work done in that realm in terms of identifying pipelines for diverse demographics to be able to have opportunities in broader networks, because I think that starts to shake up what was just referenced in terms of policy implications from immigration and migration and different aspects like that.
I agree with you, Irfan, completely. I also would add that, when we talk about hiring, and this is kind of where my conversations with my colleague, Gail Wilson, who's one of the founders of Black Teachers Association, I can count on one hand the amount of Black teachers that we have in Edmonton Public Schools, and I think I know all of them. And so, who's sitting on hiring committees? There's got to be someone, and Andrew talked about allyship. There's got to be someone on every hiring committee that is representative of different communities. And if there aren't people sitting on those communities, we need allies to get those people in those positions. As a recent graduate, well, it's not recent, but I graduated a long time ago at the University of Alberta. You'll get even the representation of the faculty in my different departments, not very representative of diverse people. So, we may be a higher thinking institution, a pretty liberal minded institution, but there's still these patriarchal, very ingrained systems of hiring. And we'll go back to the conversation of who's sitting at the table. Were you invited? I mean, why do we have to be invited to the table? We should have had a seat there already. And if we don't, we're going to build our own damn table with our own materials. And so, we need to start taking a look at who's sitting on these hiring committees in every single industry, across the board. And I think that's number one. Number two, I would argue, even with regards to representation in professions like mine of teaching, I would argue that the primary demographic of my undergraduate classes used to be white females. And now we're seeing a little bit more diversity with regards to representation, but why is it only a certain, demographic of people that are applying to education? We'll go back to systemic issues with regards to access and education. Education is a treaty right. And so how are educational institutions and system failing Indigenous children and Indigenous students? We could go on and on and on and go as far back as we want to, but again, it goes back to representation, and our education system, and how are we going to, rectify these issues, these large, massive, gaping holes with regards to equal access and funding.
Perfect. Can I chime in here too? Okay. Well, as far as I alluded to, even within the Black Teachers Association, that is one of the 5 branches that we talk about. Specifically, even the conversations between Gail, myself, Mr. Powell, and Sarah. Sarah represents Catholic School Board, myself and Gail, and Mr. Powell, who's a retired teacher now, represent the Edmonton Public School Board. At the outset of this association, we knew that was an issue. We knew that we wanted to establish a connection with the youth that are now attending university in the Faculty of Education and ensuring that they had a network. We wanted to make sure that they had job opportunities. We have situations right now, guys, and I'm sure other ethnic minorities could speak to this, where there are people who have their dual degrees or master's degrees who have been subbing now for 7-8 years, instead of having an established role in a high school, in a junior high, in an elementary, which is outlandish to me, because I feel that in some of these schools where they have a predominantly ethnic minority base in terms of student population, you would think that these people who hold such high standards in terms of education could hold jobs in all of our districts. And not only that, imagine the work that could be done with these people in these places, and imagine how many more students of ethnic minorities that could become teachers in the future and eventually change the outlook of society. If society doesn't allow these people to hold these positions, we're going to be running into these issues again. We're going to be talking about George Floyd. We're going to be talking about Ahmaud Akbari. We're going to be talking about Breonna Taylor for years and years and years, instead of finding ways to educate the youth and putting these people with different faces in these positions to talk to the youth, so that eventually they can hold those conversations and change society for the better. And for me, it's a no-brainer. However, I'm trying to work incredibly hard, when Farha knows this, between myself and Gail and all the other members in BTA, to ensure that our youth are supported, that they know that, education is a great, great occupation. And not only that, with our allies who are working incredibly hard with us, the goal is to make sure that everyone gets a chance, and an equal chance, a fair chance at becoming educators and changing education, and hopefully changing society.
Thank you, Andrew. Was there anyone else who wanted to jump in on that question? So another question we have, and maybe this is the one that we'll end on, and the question is about, how do we know if we're speaking to the converted already? So, we often hear on social media the danger of creating your own echo chamber, where you're just, you're sharing these links and these videos, and but you're sharing to people who already agree with you. So how do we break out of that in our own lives, so that we can reach the people who don't want to engage in these conversations?
So I'm going to jump in on that one first. So I had chatted earlier about, I think number one, we need to acknowledge the fact that everybody has the capacity to be racist, and not everybody's going to swallow that pill well or easily. I also think that on the other end of the spectrum, if people are unwilling to understand that we have the capacity to float in and out of being racist and anti-racist depending on context, situation, company, like who's in the room, who's not. I think there also has to be a point in which, people have the option to tap out, in the sense that we, meaning people of Black, Indigenous, people of color, cannot always front the burden of educating others. And it is mentally exhausting. And so I have had to respectfully, take myself out of conversations that have been literally emotional vacuums for people who just will not, sit and absorb. And someone somewhere in the chat asked something to the effect of, at what point do we need to, educate others, and other people need to take on the responsibility. I wholeheartedly agree. And while, we can be the change agents, and we can be the change instigators, and help ignite that awareness in people, it really does have to come from within. And people do need to, to accept the responsibility that this is an ongoing, lifelong process. And nobody is an expert, and you don't know it all the time. And in fact, if you think you know it all, you probably know nothing. So the more you actually learn, the more you realize, like, I know very little. Every time I read a book, every time I listen to a lecture, every time I engage in research, I'm left feeling like I need to know more. And that is something that we need to foster in our children, in our parents. I mean, my parents immigrated here in the early 60s, and the conversations I've had with my parents about, different topics, if they are willing to learn and change, and my dad is willing to change, I believe that everybody has the capacity to change, but it's not necessarily always our job to make sure that change happens. All we can do is arrive at the conversation, highlight things that need to be talked about, back things up with research and not opinion, listen to experts when it comes to issues around race and racism. And then really, it has to be the onus on the individual to do some of that learning.
Yeah, I think just to build off of that, I'm being mindful of time, but just to build off of that, I think when you see kind of what we're seeing right now with more organizations getting comfortable to speaking up about it, it moves that barometer more than it did before. And so I think that's where you kind of start to build those further allies. There's always going to be discomfort in this work. I fully 100% agree with Farha that this work is long-term. It's likely generational that we'll see these shifts and these changes, but it's one of those pieces that as you see more and more people show up and speak out, and then now it's, the collective momentum in building something, whether through policy or procedure or process, that's how you start to slowly shift those types of, resistors, I would say. And, again, I'll just kind of end on this, the fact that in Edmonton and in other Canadian cities, we had thousands and thousands and thousands of people show up in anti-racism rally that may have never shown up in the past. Point is see that volume is there, but now it's up to kind of, us alluding to the emotional labor that's involved in this work, but also kind of connecting with other broad-minded folks to really push that barometer more into change and action. I think you never want to let kind of an opportunity like this slide away and not take advantage of some good that can come out of it. So I'm really hopeful in this terms of this movement turning into a broader spoke of change.
And I'd like to just add one thing as well. I think that it's important to recognize that there's a spectrum and not everyone is at the same level. So sometimes you need to make the information that you're sharing digestible depending on where that person is at. And also that notion of knowing when to call in and call out. And it's not just for the marginalized people of color to do that work, it's for allies to do as well. So when do you invite someone into the conversation as an educational moment? And when do you speak up and say, like, this is offensive, this behavior needs to stop?
Hi, and I wanted to add that the conversation has to be genuine. Both people have to understand the strengths and weaknesses of each person. It can't just be you did this and this happened and that happened and that, and because it's people are going to get turned off. It has to be open and honest and genuine. And I've personally experienced these conversations. When we first started the Black Teachers Association, there's over 150 emails and DMs that Sarah and I had to go through. A lot of them were very positive and some of them were not. Some of them were, saying this, that, and the third about us and personal attacks, etc. We know that some people, are not going to be ready to engage in these conversations, but I think it takes a significant amount of patience and genuinity in these conversations in order to build something beautiful for the future.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. I think that's a great note to end on. And thank you again, everyone, to all of our panelists for sharing with us. I hope everyone today who attended learned as much as I did and was inspired and moved during this conversation. As I shared in the chat, I will be writing up a list of resources. We all shared a lot of great starting points and ways to kind of share with others as well. So I'll be sharing that with our attendees. And we may have more sessions, more events like this in the future. So if everyone just wants to keep an eye on our website at epl.ca/City of Learners, we'll be posting more there. So thank you again, everyone, and have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. See you in the multiverse. Cheers.